Hello, everyone. Uh, this is the CME that I'd mentioned to you guys that I could not find the recording of. I figured that I would just make a recording of it now, and this will be abbreviated from how uh, long this normally is. I usually go very, very in depth, but I also teach this at the ALS and the BLS level. So I'm gonna cut off some of the extra chunks here and try and get down more to the heart of it. But this is basically the class that I had mentioned to you guys that covers the true reality behind what we see when we are talking about hypoxic drive, because we know that hypoxic drive, in the sense that we normally think of it, just isn't realistic to how our body works. So, Um, if you ever come to one of my other CMEs, you'll see that they're like research papers. They always have a fun title and then a real subtitle. So this class is called "Is More Oxygen Not More Better?" Um, and it's about hyperoxemia. Um, and you can see I have not taught this one since I finished the paramedic program because I still have myself on there as NREMT. So normal objectives for this, we review the ventilation, respiration, and ventilatory drive. We're going to talk basically about VQ mismatch is the main thing that we take away for this. Uh, Risks of hyperoxemia, hyperoxemic hypercapnia, which is, if most of our science words are worth $5, that's a $20 science word, hyperoxemic hypercapnia. And I would challenge, if you're out there listening to this right now, for you to think back about what that would mean, hyperoxemic hypercapnia. So, and then we'll talk about best practices at the end. A CME is only as useful as what you take home from it. So those are basically going to be our main take homes. So normally I'm going to try and be a little bit lighter on the terminology than I am when I do this class normally. But normally I really push the science words on people, and we'll go through some of them quickly. Um, a lot of this just comes down to the fact that all of respiration and perfusion is really about the partial pressure of a gas inside our blood and inside the air and inside our cells, and not just about the actual, um, not just about how much is in there, like a fixed quantity of how much is in there. So PaO2 is the pressure of oxygen inside our arteries. PaCO2 is the same thing, but for carbon dioxide. FiO2 I've talked about in class several times. That's our fraction of inspired oxygen. Hypoxemia is low levels of oxygen in the blood in the arteries. Hyperoxemia, opposite of that, high levels of oxygen in the blood in the arteries. Hypercapnia, high levels of CO2. Acidosis is a decrease in pH from our body's normal range. Ventilation, we've covered, I've said this one a million times in class now. Air going in and out is ventilation, and then respiration is about gas change at our capillary level. Now, if I can find my mouse, I will make a quick note about this one right here. So, hypoxemia is the term we use to refer specifically to how much oxygen is in the blood. And then, as RJ has said before, hypoxia is when we have low levels of oxygen getting into the tissues. Um, they're pretty related in most normal cases. Oh, my camera just went out. What the heck from there? I don't know. Oh, that's a different camera. That was weird. Let me zoom. Okay, let's try to keep going from there, I guess. Um, and then there's a few of these other ones that we'll basically consider equivalent for ease of learning, because most of these we can't directly measure in the field. So PaO2, PaCO2, these are okay. I think I'm just going to go without camera because my whole computer's trying to bug out now about this. PaO2, PaCO2, those are blood gas values, and we don't really take blood gases in the field. So we're not going to worry too much about those as concrete items, but we can think of PO2 as a learning tool as being similar to SPO2. So SPO2 being sort of our analog for PO2, and then for PaCO2, we can think our EtCO2. We can think of our title as being roughly similar to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and our SpO2 being roughly similar to our partial pressure of oxygen within the blood. Um, the only one of these we can really directly control is this FiO2. We have lots of supplemental oxygen devices, and what we do with each of them is basically adjust the FiO2. We use a nasal cannula, we give a little boost in FiO2. We use an on-rebreather, we really boost our FiO2. So that's the terminology. Like I said, I'm going to try not to be too hard on it within this presentation. I'm going to skip through the case study. Basically, what we have here is we have a patient who has a history of COPD. He's, not really not doing well. So these are his vitals. We can see super low oxygen saturation. Um, right here, 81, and he's already on a home nasal cannula we saw here. So what we're often taught to do, we slap a non-rebreather on him, um, and get going to the hospital. And then when we see that our SpO2 has come right up, but our patient looks much worse. And basically, the question we're trying to answer with this CME is why does our patient look worse after we got their SpO2 up? So he needed oxygen. I gave him the oxygen, and basically, we say historically in EMT classes that this is the hypoxic drive. And we'll get into more why we think of it that way in a minute. So I'm going to try and be quick with this. If you're still not feeling super confident on the ventilatory process and airway anatomy, that kind of stuff, go back and watch the review for the exam 2 retake. Even if you're not retaking exam 2, we really broke it down in that session and got into the heart of it. So the airway, um, warms the air, it humidifies the air. Um, but its main thing is just getting air in and down to the alveoli. The joke that I make when I normally teach this class is this little elephant dude that I had in my bedroom when I was sick as a kid also warms and humidifies the air. So airway's not doing a whole lot. The alveoli is really what we're going to focus on in this presentation. So quick review of respiration. Oxygen comes in here. It diffuses into these cells that are heavy in carbon dioxide and low in oxygen. CO2 comes back out in this direction, and then it flows off to the pulmonary vein. The respiratory drive. All right, I will take a little bit of time here. I'm still not going to try and get too chemistry on this. Obviously, you can see that there is a lot of chemistry on this slide. Basically, we increase CO2 in the blood here, which does make our blood acidic. But the important thing, partially, is that although the CO2 can cross this blood-brain barrier, so this is a blood vessel, and down here we have our CSF. So these two are interacting with each other. This little H plus right here, This is to represent acid. This is a proton, and it's here to represent one molecule of acid, basically. This on its own can't cross the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier doesn't accept this little ion to cross it, but the CO2 can. So really what happens to drive our respiration or our ventilation is CO2 gets into the blood-brain barrier, which also has water. And like I said in our exam 2 review, CO2 and water interact. They form this, which is carbonic acid. And then that breaks off and start to make our CSF more acidic. This is our chemoreceptor that we talked about in class. This acid molecule binds to the chemoreceptor, and that tells our respiratory centers to start ventilating more because we have more acid than we need in our blood. Um, I'm going to keep it at that, not go too far into it. Taking some pathology into this. So everything there was how we want it to happen. You know, we want go back the slide. We want oxygen to come in, it exchanges, CO2 to go out. This is how our body knows when it's time to breathe to make that happen. Our blood starts to get more acidic and it tells our body to breathe. COPD, here we can see this is a healthy bronchus. It's nice and wide and open. There's a little bit of mucus in here to moisten the walls and keep everything, everything in your body is moist. Always remember that your bones are wet. Nothing inside you is very dry. Over here, we can see a bronchus that is inflamed from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, where we have this inflammation, so it's narrowed the bronchial passage, and we have excess mucus here, which is making it even smaller and more difficult for air to flow through. So it's worth pointing out here that COPD is a term that covers a few different diseases. And really, what we're going to focus on here is our chronic bronchitis patients. COPD also covers emphysema as its other big part. Emphysema is a little bit more about the alveoli themselves. We're more worried in this case about our chronic bronchitis patients. So basically, what we see here is CO2 get retained inside the alveoli because these passages are narrowed. And if I can get my camera to come back on, normally I gesture a lot when I talk, and it's making it annoying that you just can't see me. So we have our bronchial passage, and normally air flows in and out just fine. However, remember that exhalation is a passive process. Air needs to sort of want to flow up and out. It doesn't get pushed out the way that air gets pulled in when we breathe inward, which is an active process. So when our bronchi are inflamed and closed up like this, we inhale, we pull air in somewhat, but when we exhale, the CO2 that's supposed to be getting blown out stays in the alveoli because there's nothing pushing it up through these narrow, difficult to pass through bronchial passages. So let's talk a little bit about the idea behind hypoxic drive. Your book lays it out a little bit, but this is the theory. When we have so much CO2 in our blood all the time from this retention, from what's going on here, we end up with too much CO2 in our blood persistently over time. We can think of this as like a patient whose end tidal is always in high 40s or low 50s instead of the 35 to 45 range that we like to have them in. When we have that situation, our body says, okay, the chemoreceptors just ain't working anymore. This isn't working out. They are just telling me to breathe all the time. So we're going to revert back to what people to describe as a more like primordial respiratory drive. And that's basing are when to breathe on the level of O2 in our blood. So normally our body says high CO2, it's time to breathe. But in these chronic patients, CO2 is always high. So our body's okay, let's switch and say breathe when O2 is low. Uh, because of that, the danger in our situation would be that when we increase the fraction of inspired oxygen, we increase the O2 levels in the blood, and then the body doesn't feel like it needs to breathe anymore. The theory here is that once we revert to this system that says, okay, the O2 is low, it's time to breathe, then if we give them too much O2, nothing's going to tell them to breathe anymore. The problem with this theory is that O2 receptors, like while they do exist, they don't do this. This just isn't the way that they work on a physiologic level. Um, and the other thing we see that I've noted here is that the the amount of hypoxia we would need to have for a long time um, to end up in this situation where our body always relied on oxygen levels to tell us to breathe, we would be so hypoxic all the time that it's just not compatible with life. We would need to be persistently living in like the 60 and 70% range for this theory of hypoxic drive to be accurate. So there's this study literally 45 years ago, something that I like to point out. We've known about this for a very long time. Uh, that was done by this, principal investigator, last name Obier. You can look up the study. It's a little difficult to interpret now because it is pretty old. But it's a good reference to figure out what's actually going on in hypoxic drive. It's really the original one. So what we're seeing here is a couple graphs taken directly from that study where they took 22 patients with a history of COPD, actively in respiratory failure, and they put them on high flow oxygen. And basically this is a graph of those patients' tidal volume over time after being placed on oxygen. So what we can see here is before they were placed on oxygen, they're hitting tidal volumes in the 340-ish range. Initially, when we first place them on oxygen, those tidal volumes do seem to dip. And this initial dip we thought was going to be hypoxic drive. We expected that as we put them on oxygen, this train was going to sort of flow down like this. As we put them on oxygen, their hypoxic drive would kick in, and then we would expect their tidal volumes to decrease because nothing was telling the body to breathe anymore. But that's obviously not what happens. We see a little dip at the very beginning, and then we actually see that we start to flatten out over time. And we end up pretty close to where our total volumes were before we started. Now, it's not surprising that we don't make it all the way back up to those tidal volumes because we are giving them more oxygen, so a high tidal volume isn't as necessary. But we certainly don't see that their respiratory drive is going away as we provide them with more oxygen. So this is blood gas samples from this original Obier study. Um, and I'll take a minute and break down what each of these are. So they drew their blood gas twice. Once right before they started with the high flow oxygen, and then once again after they'd been breathing 100% inspired oxygen for 15 minutes. What we see is that before they put them on oxygen, their PaO2 was a little low, and their PaCO2 was a little high. We're looking not exactly for that 35 to 45 range when we're talking about arterial blood gas, but we're looking for pretty close to that. There's just a little bit more variability, but we can see that we're still high. We're 20 points above the 45 that we might expect, and we can see that our pH. Um, I'll write this up here because we don't really talk about it in this class. Normal pH is 7.35 to 7.45. So before we put them on oxygen, their oxygen levels are a little bit low. Their carbon dioxide levels are a little bit high, and their pH is just slightly acidic. We can see 7.34 is just barely below this bottom end of normal. So they're just very barely acidic. Once we put them on oxygen, obviously oxygen goes through the roof. The amount of oxygen they have in their blood is now sky high. And remember, I said we can use SbO2 as an analog for PaO2. These are not SbO2 numbers. Like they were not saturated 38% beforehand. This is a direct pressure measurement. So think of these numbers more as what changed relative to the previous and not necessarily the number itself. That's why I didn't bother putting units up here or anything like that. So our PaO2 obviously goes super high when we put them on 100% inspired oxygen. But so does our PaCO2. We put them on more oxygen and we saw, yes, their oxygen went up, but they became more hypercapnic. They started retaining more carbon dioxide when we put them on more oxygen. And then we can see here that our pH dipped way, way lower. They're now very, very notably acidic. Um, and this is going to end up being what's really the problem when we talk later about why we see these symptoms that we normally associate with hypoxic drive. And this change is only over 15 minutes. So we dropped their pH by a lot in just 15 quick minutes. And the question is why? Why is this the way that it is? And I'm going to slow down a little bit here and not rush as much through this next portion, because this is really where the heart of it is. VQ and mismatch. So we talked a little bit about VQ in class. But basically, VQ is a ratio between the amount of ventilation we're doing, the amount of air that's getting in and out of the alveoli, and the amount of perfusion that we have, which is how much blood is successfully getting to the alveoli to pick up that oxygen that we're pulling in. And the thing we need to maintain is a gradient between the two. Remember that what matters most is that the pressure is high in the alveoli and low in the capillary of oxygen, so that oxygen wants to transfer over to balance the pressures. And then the same on the flip side for carbon dioxide, we want the pressure of carbon dioxide to be low in the alveoli and high in the capillary so that the carbon dioxide wants to leave the capillary and get into the alveoli where it can be exhaled. So our ventilation is supporting that change by maintaining a high pressure of oxygen and a low pressure of CO2 by continuously changing out the air that's in the alveoli as we inhale and exhale. Our perfusion maintains that gradient pressure by bringing blood that has a lot of CO2 and not a lot of oxygen. These two both need to be doing their jobs consistently in order to maintain a difference between the alveolar pressures and the capillary pressures. And if one of them's not doing that, then we say we have a VQ mismatch. Go to the next slide. There we go. So VQ mismatch. Um, there are two kinds of ways that we can be mismatched on our VQ. We're really only going to worry about one today. But I'll talk quickly about both of them. So I'll start with dead space ventilation because that's the one that we're not going to talk about today. Basically, um, dead space ventilation happens when high V is present. We're still bringing air in and out of the alveoli, no problem. But for some reason, we're not getting enough perfusion. And if there's not blood coming to this alveoli or alveolus to exchange, then this alveolus basically becomes more dead space. We already know that we have a lot of dead space in our airway. All of our mouth, all of our pharynx, all of our trachea and our bronchi, no exchange is happening there. So we don't want to add more dead space to a system that already has a lot of dead space. And when we don't bring blood to alveoli, that's what happens. Those alveoli basically become dead space because they're not participating in that respiration. The big case where we see this is pulmonary embolism. If the blood flow is blocked to a huge group of alveoli, then we just added a ton of dead space to our lungs. The one we are going to focus on today is shunt perfusion, which is when we don't have enough ventilation, but our perfusion is still happening at its normal rate. Blood is still going to all the alveoli, but air is not adequately being exchanged. Now, I'm going to really try and slow down here because when I don't have an audience in front of me, I tend to go really fast. And this next part is where we start to get a little bit more complicated. So, in low VQ situations, which is what we have here, the alveoli are not being ventilated well enough, but they are still being highly perfused. So, we have a lot of blood still flowing through here. Next slide. This is our body's way of compensating for this. Sorry. So our body has a natural system to compensate for when we have low volumes of air going in and out of the alveoli. And it's called hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. Long word. People tried to shorten it to HPV as a good acronym. I don't use that because hopefully we all know that HPV is a different infectious virus that we worry about, and I don't want to cause confusion between those things. Basically, how HPV works is we have this alveolus here that we're just using it as an example. It has a low pressure of oxygen in it. To compensate for that, so that we don't end up with a mismatch between our ventilation and our perfusion, the body constricts the venules and the arterioles that go to this alveolus so that we can match them again. So basically, we have our V and we have our Q. Our V has gotten low. We have a difference between the two. So even though the ideal case is not that we just turn off this alveolus, because now we lose it, that's basically what our body does because it's better to have them matched than it is to have this difference between them, even if they're matched at a lower level. So normal alveolus, we have good V and we have good Q. Um, so we're getting a good amount of ventilation between the two, and we have a lot of blood persistently flowing through so that the gases can exchange between the two of them. In this alveolus that's highlighted green here, our V has gone down. We're getting low ventilation. So our body naturally brings down the Q by constricting the arteries and veins that supply this alveolus. So once again, we're matched. And the way that it does that is by detecting how much oxygen is in that alveolus. It will bring down the perfusion to match the amount of oxygen that's going in and out of that alveolus. And that's called hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. When we have low oxygen, our body constricts the pulmonary veins and arteries to supply less perfusion to those alveoli that are not being ventilated as well. Now, what we do as EMTs when we have these people with low saturations is we give them a bunch of extra oxygen. We increase their fraction of inspired oxygen, and now we have plenty of oxygen. We increase that partial pressure of oxygen in all of these alveoli, including this one that previously was being vasoconstricted. When we do that, because this hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction is based on the amount of oxygen inside the alveolus, that blood vessel opens back up again because we've given it more oxygen. So the body thinks that our ventilation is getting better. So those blood vessels open back up, and now we can see all these alveoli are being perfused the same again. What happens is the CO2 in our blood then goes into the alveoli. It doesn't get ventilated outward. It doesn't get exhaled because this bronchus is still constricted and gross and mucousy, and exhalation is a passive process. So the CO2 can't flow outward. But now that we've opened up these blood vessels, more CO2 still arrives to these and it goes into the alveoli. And then more arrives and more goes into the alveoli. But we're still not getting any ventilation. So CO2 gets held up in these alveoli until uh, we have all this CO2 that's backed up and our gradient pressure starts to go away. Remember that we need to have low amounts of CO2 in the alveoli for CO2 to want to leave the blood and go into the alveoli. Now that we've built up all this CO2 that isn't getting ventilated outward, no CO2 is coming out of the blood into this group of alveoli, and it starts to build up in the blood. What this eventually causes is acidity. Like we talked about a handful of slides ago, as we build up CO2 in the blood starts to get more acidic. So we're going to take a minute. We're going to look at the signs and symptoms of acidosis, high acidity, relative to a problem with our respiration. Tachypnea, tachycardia, sweating, altered mental status, seizures, and we group all of these together into something called CO2 narcosis. This is the term that I want you to replace hypoxic drive with in your head. When we give this oxygen, and I'll go back quick to here, go all the way back in this animation. When we give this oxygen, we open up these vessels, and in doing so, we cause our body to retain more CO2. And that leads to this CO2 narcosis. That's what I want you guys to remember from this, if you watch it. This is not a required video. I probably should have said at the beginning. CO2 narcosis is acidity in our body relative to the buildup of CO2 secondary to a respiratory process. CO2 narcosis. And all of these things are what we used to think was caused by the hypoxic drive. The main thing that we thought about with hypoxic drive was, well, we gave them more oxygen, and now their respiratory drive is starting to go down because they're relying on low oxygen levels to promote respiration. Really, what it is when people get into the bad stages of CO2 narcosis, their mental status starts to decline. They become too acidic and their mental status starts to decline, and that can affect their respiratory drive. As their body is starting to get more out of it and they're doing the head bobbing and they're just starting to get weak, that's what we see as their respiratory drive declining. It's not actually oxygen that tells the body not to breathe anymore. So we're going to bring back the Obeer trial for a second and revisit this with the knowledge that we've gained now. Basically, when we look again at this O2, we can see where the problem comes from. Our normal pH range is 7.35 to 7.45. As you guys continue in your career as EMTs, you'll find out that slight changes in pH can very quickly alter both a patient's presentation and also a patient's survivability. The body does not like to be acidic and it does not like to be basic. It likes to be right in its little range. So we are quite far outside our 7.35 to 7.45 range with this 7.25 number that we see in the Obier trial for patients that get placed on high flow oxygen when they're in respiratory failure from COPD. All right. Even when I normally, if I was doing this presentation, we'd be a little over an hour in at this point. We kind of crammed it all into the last 35 minutes or so. So that's a lot. Quick review. Our body compensates for low oxygen levels in the alveoli by constricting vessels. That's our hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. We introduce passive oxygenation, which decreases this vasoconstriction. It opens the blood vessels back up. It increases our Q, but our ventilation hasn't gotten any better. Our ventilation is still low, and we've basically worsened this mismatch. CO2 can exchange, but it's not getting ventilated out. Our alveolar CO2 starts to go up and exchange starts to go away. We don't have a gradient pressure to tell CO2 to leave the blood and go into the alveoli because it's starting to build up. Blood starts to retain that CO2 and our body becomes more acidic. And that's why we start to see the altered mental status, and the head bobbing and the decrease in ventilation. Because as our body becomes more acidic, we just basically start to shut down. So what do we do? You know, their saturation's low. I have oxygen. I give them oxygen, and you tell me it makes them worse. So is this just a lost cause? Like, should we just throw our COPD patients on the stretcher and let them die? Hope that we can get to the hospital before they die? Obviously not. This would be a very bad CME if that were the case. So best practices for our patients that have hypoxia, when they have also have a history of COPD. Three things that we're going to keep in mind. We're going to target better oxygen saturations than just trying to get them upward. We're going to try and dilate the bronchi because remember, our biggest problem here is that the CO2 is not getting ventilated outward when we push it into the alveoli because the bronchi are narrow and full of gunky mucus. And we're going to support their ventilation itself. So, first piece of that, targeted O2 sats. I mentioned this in class when we did airway, but the British Thoracic Society recommends saturations of 88 to 92% for people who are at risk of this. Now, obviously, that includes our COPD patients. Our COPD patients are our, poster child for hypercapnic respiratory failure, but also it includes those that are morbidly obese. Morbidly obese patients also are going to have a hard time ventilating out carbon dioxide because they have a physical obstruction, extra weight pushing down on their lungs. And then neuromuscular disorders, chest wall deformities, all these things that just involve making it difficult to get air out. So when we have these COPD patients, we're not going to shoot for our normal 94 to 99%. We're going to shoot for 88 to 92 when we have these long-time chronic COPD patients, not for every patient. Bronchodilation. The big thing we have here is a ventilatory problem. We're not ventilating CO2 out, so we're going to try and open up those airways. This is a little bit older. It still just says albuterol within the EMT's scope of practice. Obviously, ipratropium is also in the is also in the basic scope of practice now. It's not just AEMTs and up. And then at the BLS level, we have epinephrine. Remember that epinephrine is still a bronchodilator, and we think of it as a medication for anaphylaxis, but it will bronchodilate in All sorts of different patients. So if we're in one of these situations, these are the people that we make the phone call to the doctor and we say, hey, you know, we tried the Duoneb. It's running right now, but this patient just doesn't look like it's going to be enough. I would like to give them epi to open up their bronchi because of this and this and this patient presentation reason. Um, this is the same thing that I mentioned in class. All of these medications have cardiac effects. So consider that when you're giving these medications. And as I told you guys in class, the main one that I really want you to think about that with is epinephrine. I don't want you to be too concerned about the tachycardia that results from ipratropium and albuterol. I want you to more consider that when we're talking about epinephrine. Our third prong is supporting their ventilation itself. So CPAP or BiPAP, BiPAP always if it's an option, but it's so rarely an option, especially where we are. So CPAP gives a little bit of pressure to support that ventilation, and it's most often going to be effective when you match it with a bronchodilator. The nice thing about CPAP, like we talked about in class, is that we can take a CPAP mask, we can put it on, and then we can hook a nebulizer right into the CPAP. So not only are we giving them the nebulized medication, we're giving it in conjunction with pressure to help keep their alveoli open and support that ventilation back and forth. Um, and then patients that are already too far into narcosis to tolerate CPAP, they're already moving on to that altered mental status portion. Um, they will get the BVM. And this is a little bit of a soapbox of mine. The hardest thing about BVMing a conscious patient is starting to BVM a conscious patient, like especially doing it for the first time. When people that are in respiratory failure that you would normally say this person needs CPAP, when they can't tolerate CPAP, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the time to go to a non-rebreather. More often, I would say it's the time to go to the BVM. Um, the BVM is a tool that we don't use often enough. I think in conscious patients, we tend to let them push more and more towards respiratory failure and arrest because we're afraid of putting this mask on a conscious person. We think about it as something that we use in cardiac arrest, and that's not the only time that we're going to be pulling out our BVMs. Um, Last note on BBMing here, be careful of gastric insufflation. That's be careful of putting air into the stomach. Um, and because when these people get to the hospital, they're very often going to be intubated. And when we go to intubate them, if we overinflated their stomach with air, there's a really high chance that they're going to vomit. And that makes intubation both less successful, but also more dangerous for the patient. Even a successful intubation in a patient that's vomiting has a very high risk of an aspiration pneumonia. And that can be dangerous, obviously. A lot of people have died from sepsis secondary to aspiration pneumonia. So, reviewing our objectives. This is what I said at the beginning of this we wanted to focus on. Obviously, this is not the full format. I think we're going to end up finishing this in about half the time that I normally teach this class. But first off, we wanted to understand the physiology of ventilation, respiration, and the ventilatory drive. So ventilation, easy peasy. Air goes in and out. Respiration, gases are exchanged in the alveoli because we have a gradient of pressure between the gas in the alveoli and the gas in the capillary. And increasing CO2 in the blood increases the acidity of our cerebrospinal fluid, and that is what tells our body to ventilate. I don't want anyone to think about low levels of oxygen causing our body to ventilate. Our body ventilates because the CSF becomes more acidic. So, disputing myths of hyperoxygenation. Hypoxic drive, as we used to think about it, is inherently flawed. And especially that Obeer trial, but many studies since have shown that increasing the fraction of inspired oxygen does not make our patients ventilate less. It just doesn't happen. It's a flawed idea. All right. Understand the relationship between ventilation and perfusion and the pathology of mismatch. This is the bigger, more confusing part. So we need our V and Q to match to adequately perfuse the body. In theory, our VQ would be 1, meaning that our V and our Q would be the same. And when we have a fraction like VQ is, where the top and the bottom are the same, that equals 1. The body compensates for low ventilation with good perfusion by sending less blood to that alveolus or that chunk of alveoli so that when our ventilation comes down, we bring the Q down to match the 2. And that process is called hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. Another $10 science word. Understand the risks of hyperoxemic hypercapnia. So hopefully everyone spent some time when I said at the very beginning to try and figure out what that was. Hyperoxemic hypercapnia means we send high oxygen. We end up with high levels of oxygen in the blood. And because of that, we also cause high CO2 in the blood. So hyperoxemic, high oxygen, hypercapnia, high carbon dioxide. We end up increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the blood because we gave them too much oxygen. So, understanding risks of hyperoxemic hypercapnia, increasing the fraction of inspired oxygen that we give our patients breaks our body's natural ability to adjust V and Q to match each other. It stops hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction from working. It causes CO2 to retain inside the blood, and we end up with CO2 narcosis, this altered mental status, tachypnic diaphoretic state, where eventually our patients could go unconscious or could have seizures because they're acidic, not because we gave them too much oxygen directly. All right, and then our best practices for oxygenation of hypoxic patients. We're going to target our O2 sats 88 to 92%. We're going to give heavy bronchodilators, albuterol and ipratropium, epinephrine if we can get the go-ahead from med control. And then if we can get ALS on board as paramedics, we also can give magnesium, which is a really, really aggressive bronchodilator. And then we're going to support the ventilation directly. And that's CPAP. That's BiPAP if we had it. We're always going to go for the BiPAP over CPAP if we have it. And then if they're just not aware enough for that, we're going to go to the BBM. And I don't want you guys to be scared of going for the BBM. All right. I'm going to be really quick about this because this is normally just a little tail to the presentation. But personal note, when I first was writing this training a couple of years ago, it was much more broad and it was about the dangers of over-oxygenating patients in a more general scope. And this applies a little bit more to when we have patients on BiPAP or patients that are intubated and less so to our 911 calls at the lower levels. But um, all across the board, over-oxygenating our patients is shown to increase mortality. I just chose in this presentation to focus on CO2 narcosis. But the days of putting every single patient we have or patients that are at 90, 92% on 15 liters via non-rebreather, those days are over. It's just we're not doing that anymore. It's not what's right for our patients. We titrate our oxygen to get our SpO2 within the recommended ranges. So for our average patient, that's 94 to 99%. And like we said earlier in this presentation, for our patients that we think are at risk for this CO2 narcosis, that's 88 to 92%. I just don't want to see, massive amounts of oxygen thrown at every patient anymore. I don't want you guys to be concerned when you go to put oxygen on a patient. One of the big things when I was first getting this training accredited was they were afraid people would leave this training thinking I shouldn't give my patients oxygen anymore. When our patients need oxygen, we need to be giving it to them. More, what I want you to consider is what is my goal oxygenation and what is the best tool to give it by. One of the big things in CO2 narcosis is that something like a non-rebreather just gives that passive oxygenation, whereas CPAP, BiPAP, BBM help support ventilation overall as a process, and they don't just increase fraction of inspired oxygen. So I don't want you to be afraid of giving oxygen, but I want you to be mindful of what oxygen saturations we're trying to hit and how we are getting them to that saturation, what adjuncts we're using to increase that. And then there's this trial that you're welcome to reference. It's called the IOTA trial, Improving Oxygen Therapy in Acute Illness. And it helped show that across trauma, respiratory failure, stroke, all these different pathologies, giving 100% fraction of inspired oxygen to every patient made outcomes worse. We need to be titrating our oxygen administration to get as close to the normal as we can while maintaining our patient in safe, livable ranges of SpO2. Normally, this is where we do questions, but this is pre-recorded. So if you have questions, you can email them to me or you can leave them as comments on this post in Classroom, I assume is how this will end up going up. And then when I make these, there is a lot of research that goes into them. So if you want to review any of my studies that I used when I was making this presentation, you're welcome to. This is the one that I referenced earlier by the British Thoracic Society, where they said we should target 88 to 92% in most of our patients. This is the original Obier trial that said, hey, when we give a lot of oxygen, it doesn't make people ventilate less. So hypoxic drive doesn't seem to be the problem here. Excuse me. And then the rest of these are just some reference studies that I use to flesh out the presentation. Particularly this one, for those of you guys that have never heard of this resource, Stat Pearls. Stat Pearls is a great online resource by the National Institute of Health that has a lot of these little articles on that are quick and easy to read on like every different illness, every different medication, every different physiologic process. And it's a really great resource. It's one that I turn to a lot when I want a quick answer about something on a call that's not written out in my protocol. You know, I have a patient and I think they should get this medication, but I'm concerned it might worsen their situation because of this history they have or because of this other part of their presenting illness. And I can go quick to Stat Pearls and review my mechanism of action and my contraindications to decide whether or not this is a medication I want to give them. I know there was a crazy amount of talking and it's a long presentation and it's really meant for EMTs that have a couple years on the job already and have some cases in their mind that they can connect these things with. But I wanted to throw it up there. It's an interesting presentation and I think that hopefully even in this reduced format, it might have benefited people a little bit. I did basically cut in half from how long I normally spend teaching this. So if you have questions or if you want more expansion on this because you find it interesting, comment on the Classroom post or send me an email. This is a topic I love to talk about, and I hope it helps you guys out a little bit as well. Bye-bye.